A millionaire abandons his luxurious life and assumes the identity of a farmer to win the heart of a humble teacher. However, when introduced to her family, he is met with insults and cruel words. "You smell like animals," shouted her mother, believing he was just a simple farmer. What the millionaire does next leaves everyone in shock. Thomas Preston stared at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. The city lights below sparkled like a sea of diamonds, a view that had once filled him with pride, but now felt hollow. At 38, he had everything money could buy: a successful technology empire, multiple homes across the globe, and a social calendar that read like a who's who of high society. Yet here he was, dreading another charity gala, where he'd have to smile through meaningless conversations and pretend to care about causes that were nothing more than tax write-offs for his peers. His assistant Sarah knocked on the door, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Preston, your driver is waiting. The foundation's annual charity gala begins in 30 minutes. Thomas adjusted his custom-made tuxedo and grabbed his phone. "Thank you, Sarah. You can head home for the evening." In the elevator, Thomas scrolled through his social media feeds, filled with posts from acquaintances showing off their latest acquisitions: yachts, private islands, limited edition sports cars. He had all those things too, but they'd lost their luster years ago. The sleek black Mercedes waited at the curb, its driver James holding the door open with practiced precision. As Thomas settled into the leather seat, he felt the familiar weight of expectations pressing down on him. "The usual route to the Grand Plaza, sir?" James asked, meeting his eyes in the rearview mirror. Thomas opened his mouth to say yes, but something stopped him. The thought of another evening surrounded by plastic smiles and shallow conversation made his chest tight. He loosened his bow tie slightly. "Actually, James, let's take a detour. Head east, toward the older part of town." "Sir?" James's eyebrows rose slightly, but he smoothly pulled away from the curb, following Thomas's unexpected request. As they drove, the gleaming skyscrapers gave way to smaller buildings, their facades telling stories of decades gone by. The streets here were narrower, lined with local shops and cafes instead of luxury boutiques. People walked unhurriedly, stopping to chat with neighbors or browse storefront displays. "Slow down here," Thomas instructed, as they passed a particularly lively stretch of street. The sidewalks were busy with families, young couples, and elderly, residents enjoying the mild spring evening. The energy was different from what he was used to, more authentic, more alive. Through the tinted windows, Thomas watched a group of children excitedly pointing at books displayed in a modest storefront. A woman in her early 30s, carrying a stack of worn books, approached them with a warm smile. She wore a simple flowered dress and comfortable flats, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, but there was something magnetic about her presence. "Stop the car, James." The children gathered around the woman as she balanced her load of books, their faces lighting up as she spoke to them. Even from inside the car, Thomas could see the passion in her gestures as she appeared to be describing something from one of the volumes. "Sir, the gala," James reminded him gently. "Call and send my regrets. Family emergency." The lie rolled off his tongue easily. He'd used it countless times before to escape tedious obligations, but this time felt different. This wasn't an escape. It felt more like a beginning. Thomas watched as the woman unlocked the door to what appeared to be a small library. A hand-painted sign above read, "Community Reading Haven." The children followed her inside, their excited chatter carrying across the evening air. He sat there for several minutes, observing the steady stream of people entering and leaving the library. Each person who walked through those doors seemed to carry a sense of purpose that had long been missing from his own life. "James, I need you to find out everything you can about this place, and I mean everything: who runs it, how it's funded, what programs they offer." "Of course, sir. Will you be attending tomorrow's board meeting?" Thomas barely heard the question. His mind was already racing with possibilities, ideas forming and taking shape. For the first time in years, he felt truly awake. "Sir?" "What? Oh yes, the board meeting. Cancel it." Cancel everything for the next few days. I need time to think." As James drove him back to his penthouse, Thomas couldn't shake the image of the woman with the books, or the genuine joy on the children's faces. He'd spent years building an empire, but what had he really created? What legacy would he leave behind? In his massive bedroom that night, surrounded by expensive art and designer furniture, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He opened his laptop and began researching properties for sale in that neighborhood. If he was going to understand this world, her world, he needed to become part of it. By dawn, he had a plan. It was risky, perhaps even crazy, but for E. The first time in as long as he could remember, he felt alive. The empty life he'd built for himself was about to change dramatically, and the thought filled him with equal parts terror and exhilaration. 2 weeks later, Thomas stood in the middle of a modest 2-bedroom house, surrounded by simple furniture and bare walls. The realtor had been baffled by his insistence on paying cash and closing immediately, but money had a way of smoothing over questions. The house was just 3 blocks from the community reading haven, close enough to become part of the neighborhood's daily life. He ran his hand along the kitchen counter, feeling the slightly worn laminate surface. No marble or stainless steel in sight, just honest wear from years of use. The backyard, though small, had enough space for what he had in mind. His phone buzzed with another message from his executive team. They were growing increasingly concerned about his sudden sabbatical, but Thomas had prepared for this. He'd appointed his trusted COO as interim CEO, citing personal reasons for his temporary step back. His wealth managers had arrangements in place to maintain his empire without his daily involvement. Now came the challenging part, becoming someone else entirely. He'd spent days crafting his new identity, choosing something close enough to the truth to be believable. Thomas Preston would become Tom Parker, a former corporate worker who'd left the rat race to pursue a simpler life, growing and selling organic produce. He'd studied extensively about small-scale farming, watching countless videos and reading everything he could find. The previous week, he'd visited several farmers' markets, observing how the vendors interacted with customers and managed their stands. It was a world away from corporate boardrooms, but he found himself energized by the authenticity of it all. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Outside stood Maria, an elderly woman from the neighborhood farmers' cooperative he'd contacted earlier in the week. "So, you're the new guy wanting to join our little group?" She looked him up and down, taking in his deliberately casual clothes and work boots. "Yes, ma'am, Tom Parker." He extended his hand, conscious of keeping his posture relaxed and open. "I'm hoping to learn from experienced growers like yourself." Maria's weathered face creased in a smile as she shook his hand. "Well, Tom, show me what you're working with here." They walked through the small backyard as Thomas explained his plans for raised beds and container gardening. He'd done his research thoroughly, and Maria nodded approvingly at his knowledge, though she occasionally corrected his assumptions with practical wisdom. "You've got good soil here," she said, crumbling some earth between her fingers. "But growing's only half the battle. You'll need to learn about the market too, what people want, when to bring your produce, how to price it." "I'm willing to learn everything," Thomas replied earnestly. "I want to be part of this community." Maria studied him for a moment. "The market meets every Wednesday and Saturday. Come this weekend just to observe. Watch how we set up, how we interact with customers. Then we'll talk about getting you started." After she left, Thomas began working in the yard, breaking ground for his first garden beds. The physical labor was foreign to his muscles, used to premium gym equipment rather than actual work, but it felt good, real. As he worked, he caught glimpses of people walking past his fence, children on their way home from school, elderly couples taking evening strolls, young professionals returning from work. And then he saw her, the librarian from the reading haven, walking past with another armful of books. She paused at his gate, noticing the activity in the yard. "Hello, you must be new to the neighborhood." Thomas wiped his hands on his jeans, trying to calm his suddenly racing heart. Up close, she was even more striking, with intelligent brown eyes and a natural warmth that seemed to radiate from within. "Just moved in," he managed. "Tom Parker." "Emma Martinez," she smiled, shifting the books to one arm to shake his hand. "I run the community library down the street. You should stop by sometime. We're always looking for new volunteers." "I'd like that," Thomas replied, meaning it more than she could know. "I'm starting a small urban farm here, actually, planning to sell at the local market." Emma's eyes lit up. "Really? That's wonderful. We've been trying to get more fresh produce into the neighborhood. Some of our families have limited access to healthy food." The conversation flowed easily as Emma shared stories about the library's programs and the community's needs. Thomas found himself completely engaged, asking questions and offering ideas about how his future produce could help support the library's initiatives. "I should let you get back to your work," Emma said finally, glancing at her watch. "But please, do come by the library. We're having a children's reading hour tomorrow afternoon if you're interested." As she walked away, Thomas felt a mix of guilt and excitement churning in his stomach. The connection he'd felt with her was real, but it was built on a foundation of lies. Yet, as he returned to preparing his garden beds, he couldn't help but feel that somehow this deception might lead to something truly authentic. The sun was setting when he finally stopped working, his muscles aching and his hands dirty in a way that no amount of sanitizer would quickly fix. Tomorrow, he would begin his first real test, integrating himself into the community through the library. As he watched the sky turn orange and pink over the modest rooftops of his new neighborhood, Thomas Preston, hidden beneath the persona of Tom Parker, felt more at home than he had in years. The next afternoon, Thomas found himself standing outside the community reading haven, his heart beating faster than it ever had before any major business presentation. Children's laughter drifted through the open windows, along with Emma's animated voice as she read aloud to her young audience. He pushed open the door, a small bell announcing his arrival. The library's interior was modest but welcoming, with well-worn shelves lining the walls and colorful reading nooks scattered throughout. Handmade posters advertising various reading programs and community events covered any available wall space. Emma looked up from her reading circle, her face brightening with recognition. She sat cross-legged on a colorful rug, surrounded by about 15 children of various ages, all completely engrossed in the story she was sharing. She gestured for him to join them, continuing her dramatic reading without missing a beat. Thomas settled onto the edge of the circle, watching as Emma brought the story to life. She changed her voice for different characters, used expressive gestures, and occasionally paused to ask the children questions about what might happen next. Her passion for reading was infectious, and Thomas found himself just as captivated as the children. After the story ended, the children scattered to different areas of the library, some to browse books, others to work on homework or art projects. Emma approached Thomas, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm so glad you came," she said warmly. "What did you think of story time?" "It was incredible," Thomas replied honestly. "The way you engage with the children, I've never seen anything like it." Emma's cheeks flushed slightly at the compliment. "Would you like a tour? I could show you how we organize everything and explain our different programs." For the next hour, Emma led Thomas through the library, explaining their various initiatives. They had after-school tutoring programs, adult literacy classes, ESL sessions, and weekend workshops. Everything was run by volunteers and funded through donations and community fundraisers. "Our biggest challenge is resources," Emma explained, as they reorganized a shelf of donated books. "We make do with what we have, but there's so much more we could do with proper funding. Some of our families can't afford books of their own, and our lending library can only stretch so far." Thomas felt a familiar ache in his chest, the knowledge that he could solve all these problems with a single check from his real bank account. But that would mean revealing his true identity, and he wasn't ready to lose this genuine connection he was building. "Maybe I could help," he offered carefully. "I'm planning to have my first harvest ready for the farmers market in a few weeks. I could set up a small stand here on market days, donate a percentage of the sales to the library." Emma's eyes lit up. "Really? That would be wonderful. And it would bring more people to the library too. Tom, you have no idea how much that would help." As they continued working, Thomas found himself sharing stories from his fabricated past, carefully constructed half-truths about leaving a corporate job to pursue a simpler life. Emma listened attentively, occasionally sharing her own story of choosing to open this library instead of taking a higher-paying position at a private school. "My mother still hasn't forgiven me for that decision," she admitted, shelving a stack of children's books. "She wanted me to have a respectable career with security and benefits. But this place, these kids, this is where I belong." The afternoon passed quickly as they worked together, organizing books, helping children find reading materials, and discussing ideas for future programs. Thomas discovered that Emma had a quick wit and a subtle sense of humor that made him laugh more genuinely than he had in years. As closing time approached, they worked side by side to straighten up the reading area. A young girl approached Emma, clutching a worn copy of The Secret Garden. "Miss Emma, could I take this home? I promise to be really careful with it." Emma knelt down to the child's level. "Of course, Sophia. Have you finished your other book?" Sophia nodded enthusiastically, pulling a different book from her backpack. "It was amazing. The main character reminded me of my abuela." Thomas watched their interaction, noting how Emma treated the child with genuine respect and interest. After Sophia left, Emma explained that she was one of their regular visitors, coming in almost every day after school while her single mother worked late shifts. "The books can be such a lifeline," Emma said softly, watching Sophia skip away through the window. "They open up whole new worlds of possibility, especially for kids who might not have many advantages in life." As they prepared to close the library, Emma turned to Thomas. "We're having a community potluck this weekend, sort of an informal fundraiser for the library. Would you like to come? It would be a good way to meet more people from the neighborhood." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. "I'd love to. Should I bring something?" "Just yourself," Emma smiled. "Though if you happen to have any vegetables ready from your garden, I'm sure no one would complain." Standing on the library steps as Emma locked up, Thomas felt both elated and troubled. Every moment spent with her made him more certain that he was exactly where he needed to be. But the weight of his deception grew heavier with each genuine smile she gave him. "See you Saturday?" Emma asked, shouldering her bag. "Wouldn't miss it," Thomas replied, watching as she walked away in the golden light of sunset. He had 3 days to figure out how to be the kind of person who belonged at a community potluck, and more importantly, the kind of person who deserved Emma's trust. Saturday arrived with a mix of sunshine and scattered clouds, perfect weather for an outdoor community gathering. Thomas had spent the previous days preparing, not just mentally but physically as well. His hands were actually developing calluses from working in the garden, and his expensive designer clothes had been completely replaced by practical, worn-in attire that better suited his new persona. He'd managed to grow some herbs in containers, nothing impressive, but enough to contribute something authentic to the potluck. As he carefully arranged the fresh basil and mint in a basket, his phone buzzed with another ignored message from his corporate life. His COO was getting increasingly insistent about his return, but Thomas couldn't bring himself to care about quarterly projections and board meetings anymore. The community center where the potluck was being held was just a few blocks away. As Thomas approached, carrying his modest offering, he could hear music and laughter spilling out onto the street. Families were streaming in, carrying dishes of all kinds, and children darted between the adults, playing chase in the warm afternoon air. Emma stood near the entrance, greeting people with warm hugs and helping to organize the incoming food. She wore a simple sundress with practical sandals, her hair loose around her shoulders, and Thomas thought she had never looked more beautiful. "Tom," she called out when she spotted him, "you made it!" Her smile was genuine and welcoming, but before they could talk more, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Emma, dear, who is this?" A well-dressed woman in her 60s approached, her scrutinizing gaze fixed on Thomas. Her perfectly coiffed hair and designer outfit seemed out of place among the casual atmosphere of the gathering. "Mom, this is Tom Parker," Emma said, her smile tightening slightly. "He's new to the neighborhood and has been helping at the library." "Tom, this is my mother, Victoria Martinez." Victoria extended her hand with practiced grace, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. Interesting. And what is it you do, Mr. Parker? I'm an urban farmer, Thomas replied, maintaining his composure despite her obvious disapproval. Just starting out, actually. I'm hoping to contribute to the local farmers' market soon. Victoria's eyebrows rose fractionally. A farmer? How rustic. Emma, dear, I believe Richard was looking for you earlier. You remember Richard Anderson? He's made partner at his law firm now. Emma's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Mom, please. Tom brought some fresh herbs from his garden for the potluck. Why don't we find a place for them? As Emma led him. Away, Thomas could feel Victoria's disapproving stare following them. I'm so sorry about that, Emma whispered. My mother can be a bit traditional, Thomas offered diplomatically. Emma laughed softly. That's a kind way of putting it. She's never quite accepted my choice to run the library. And Richard, he's an old family friend who's apparently been perfect for me since kindergarten. Throughout the afternoon, Thomas found himself naturally integrating into the community. He helped set up tables, played with the children, and engaged in genuine conversations with his new neighbors. Maria from the Farmers Cooperative introduced him to other local vendors, and soon he was deep in discussions about soil composition and growing seasons. However, he couldn't help but notice Victoria's constant surveillance, especially when he was near Emma. She seemed to materialize whenever they began talking, usually with Richard in tow, a polished-looking man in his late 30s who carried himself with the confidence of someone used to getting his way. So, Tom, Richard cornered him by the dessert table, his tone falsely casual. How long did you say you've been in the area? Just a few weeks, Thomas replied, maintaining his friendly demeanor, despite recognizing the interrogation for what it was. And before that, where were you based? Various places, Thomas answered vaguely, years of business negotiations helping him deflect without seeming evasive. I needed a change of pace from corporate life. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting. You know I have contacts in most major firms in the region. What did you say your previous company was? Before Thomas could respond, Emma appeared at his side. Tom, would you help me set up for the children's activity? We're going to plant some seeds in cups. Thought they might benefit from your expertise. As they walked away, Thomas felt Richard's calculating gaze following them. He'd recognized something in the lawyer's questions, the same predatory instinct he'd often encountered in corporate takeovers. The seed planting activity proved to be a hit with the children. Thomas found himself thoroughly enjoying teaching them about different types of plants and helping their small hands press seeds into soil. Emma worked alongside him, and their natural teamwork didn't go unnoticed by the watching parents. You're really good with them, Emma said softly as they cleaned up afterward. The kids, I mean. Most people don't have the patience to explain things the way you do. They remind me of why I wanted to start growing things, Thomas replied truthfully. There's something magical about helping something grow, whether it's a plant or a person's understanding. The sun was setting by the time the potluck wound down. As Thomas helped with the cleanup, he overheard Victoria speaking to Emma in harsh whispers. Really, Emma, a farmer? You could do so much better. Richard has his own practice now and he's always had feelings for you. Why waste your time with someone who plays in the dirt for a living? Thomas pretended not to hear Emma's heated response, but his heart sank. He'd known his chosen identity would create obstacles, but facing real prejudice was different from anticipating it. As he walked home that evening, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. But then he remembered the joy on the children's faces as they planted their seeds, the genuine connections he'd made with his neighbors, and most of all, the way Emma's eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams for the library. For the first time in his life, he was part of something real, something that mattered. The question was, how long could he maintain this double life before everything came crashing down? The following weeks brought a rhythm to Thomas's new life. That felt more authentic than anything he'd experienced in his years as a CEO. His garden flourished under Maria's guidance, and his first appearance at the farmers' market had been a modest success. More importantly, his connection with Emma grew stronger with each passing day. They fell into an easy routine of shared moments at the library, working side by side with the children and developing new programs together. Thomas found himself looking forward to the simplest things, the way Emma's face lit up when she discovered a new donation of books, or how she absent-mindedly tucked her hair behind her ear while reading to the children. However, Richard Anderson's presence cast an increasingly dark shadow over their budding relationship. The lawyer had taken to spending more time at the library, ostensibly to offer pro bono legal advice to community members. Thomas noticed how he always positioned himself to keep them both in view, his keen eyes missing nothing. One afternoon, as Thomas helped Emma organize a new shipment of donated books, Richard appeared in the doorway of the storage room. "Emma, your mother asked me to remind you about dinner tonight," he said, his expensive suit looking out of place among the dusty cardboard boxes. "She's expecting both of us at 7, Emma sighed, pushing a strand of hair from her face. "I forgot about that. Tom, would you mind finishing up here? I should probably head home and change." "Of course," Thomas replied, trying to ignore the triumphant glint in Richard's eye as he escorted Emma out. Once they were gone, Thomas continued sorting books, but his mind was elsewhere. He'd known this simple life wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't anticipated how complicated it would become. His feelings for Emma were real, perhaps the most real thing he'd ever experienced, but they were built on a foundation of lies. Later that evening, as Thomas tended to his garden, he heard familiar voices drifting over the fence. Richard and Victoria were walking past his house, deep in conversation. "Something doesn't add up about him," Richard was saying. "I've checked with my contacts in the major corporations in the region. No one remembers a Tom Parker matching his description." "I knew it," Victoria replied, her voice sharp with satisfaction. "No one simply abandons a corporate career to become a farmer. He's hiding something, and I won't have him taking advantage of my daughter's trusting nature." "Leave it to me," Richard assured her. "I have resources at my disposal. If he's keeping secrets, I'll find them." Thomas's hands tightened around his garden trowel. He'd been careful with his backstory, but Richard had resources and motivation. It was only a matter of time before his carefully constructed world began to unravel. The next morning, Emma surprised him by showing up at his garden with coffee and fresh pastries. "I thought you might need breakfast after all the work you've been doing here," she said, settling onto the small bench he'd built near the vegetables. Thomas joined her, accepting the coffee gratefully. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over the garden, making everything look softer, more hopeful. Emma's presence had that same effect on his world. "How was dinner?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Emma's smile faltered slightly. "The usual. My mother's ongoing campaign to remind me of all the ways I'm disappointing her." Richard spent the entire evening talking about his latest high-profile case and his new vacation home in the Hamptons. "Sounds thrilling," Thomas said dryly, earning a laugh from Emma. "Actually, it made me think about something," she continued, her expression growing more serious. "Tom, what we're doing here, the library, the community programs, your garden, it matters. It might not be prestigious or profitable, but it's real. It helps real people." Thomas felt the weight of his deception pressing down on him. Here was Emma, being completely honest about her values and choices, while he lived behind a carefully constructed facade. "Emma, he started, but was interrupted by the arrival of several children, eager to check on the seedlings they'd planted during the potluck. The morning transformed into an impromptu gardening lesson, with Thomas and Emma teaching the children about plant care and healthy eating. Watching Emma interact with the kids, her face animated with genuine joy, Thomas felt both elated and terrified. He was falling in love with her, not just her beauty or her kindness, but her passionate dedication to making the world better in whatever way she could. That afternoon, as Thomas worked in his garden alone, he noticed a car parked across the street. Through the fence slats, he could see Richard sitting in the driver's seat, apparently working on his laptop. But Thomas recognized surveillance when he saw it. He'd employed enough private investigators in his corporate life to know the signs. The game was changing. Richard wasn't just asking questions anymore. He was actively investigating. Thomas knew he should be worried, but instead he felt a strange sense of relief. Perhaps it was time for the truth to come out, but on his terms, not Richard's. As the sun set over his flourishing garden, Thomas made a decision. He would tell Emma everything, who he really was, why he'd created this new identity, and most importantly, how meeting her had transformed his understanding of what truly mattered in life. He just hoped she would understand that while Tom Parker might be a fiction, his feelings for her were absolutely real. Thomas spent the next few days trying to find the right moment to confess everything to Emma, but the opportunity never seemed to present itself. The library was busier than ever, with a new literacy program launching and preparations underway for a community fundraising event. Emma had asked him to help coordinate the farmers' market vendors for the fundraiser, and he threw himself into the task, grateful for the distraction from his growing anxiety. Yet every time he saw her smile or heard her laugh, the weight of his deception grew heavier. One morning, as Thomas set up his produce stand at the weekly market, he noticed Richard engaging in intense conversations with various vendors. The lawyer moved from stall to stall, his expensive shoes incongruous on the dusty street, occasionally making notes on his phone. Maria appeared at Thomas's side, her weathered face creased with concern. "That lawyer's been asking questions about you," she said quietly, arranging tomatoes in a basket. "Wanted to know how long I've known you, where you learned farming. I told him to mind his own business, but he's persistent." "Thank you, Maria," Thomas replied, his throat tight with gratitude for her loyalty. "I'm sorry you've been pulled into this." She patted his arm gently. "You're good people, Tom. Whatever your story is, I've seen how you care for this community. That's what matters to me." The market was particularly busy that morning, with many customers stopping by specifically to discuss the upcoming fundraiser. Thomas had just finished explaining his donation plan to a group of interested parents when he saw Emma approaching his stand, her face lighting up at the sight of his flourishing produce display. "This is amazing, Tom," she exclaimed, running, her fingers over the fresh herbs. "I can't believe how much your garden has grown. Would you like to see it?" The words were out before he could stop them. "The garden, I mean. It's best in the evening light. Maybe after the library closes. Today?" Emma's smile widened. "I'd love that." The rest of the day passed in a blur of anticipation and anxiety. Thomas spent hours preparing the garden, making sure everything was perfect. This would be the moment. He would show her the real fruits of his labor, then tell her everything. The thought made his hands shake as he arranged fresh-cut flowers in a simple vase on the small garden table. However, as the afternoon wore on, dark clouds began gathering overhead. By the time Emma was due to arrive, a steady rain was falling. Thomas watched through his window as she hurried up his walkway, holding a jacket over her head. He opened the door before she could knock, ushering her inside. "I'm so sorry about the rain," he started, but stopped when he saw her expression. Emma was holding a piece of paper, partially protected from the rain by her jacket. Her hands were trembling, slightly. "Tom, what is this?" He took the offered paper, his heart sinking as he recognized it as a printout of an old Forbes article. Although the photo was grainy, there was no mistaking his younger self standing in front of his corporate headquarters, the headline proclaiming him one of the year's most successful tech entrepreneurs. "Richard brought this to the library just before closing," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He has more: property records, corporate filings, social media posts from your real life. He says everything about you is a lie." Thomas felt the carefully constructed walls of his new life beginning to crumble. "Emma, please let me explain." "Explain what?" Her voice cracked slightly. "That you're not really a farmer? That you've been playing some kind of game with all of us, with me?" "No, it's not like that." Thomas stepped toward her, but she backed away. "Everything I feel for you, for the library, for this community, it's real." "Real?" Emma's laugh was bitter. "How can anything be real when it's built on lies? I trusted you, Tom, or whatever your name is. I defended you to my mother, to Richard, to everyone who questioned your sudden appearance in our lives." The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the windows like an accusation. Through the glass, Thomas could see his garden, real, growing, alive with possibility, just like his feelings for Emma. "You're right," he said finally. "I've been living a lie, but not about what matters. My name is Thomas Preston, and yes, I'm the CEO of Preston Tech Industries. But everything else, my love for this community, for the work we do at the library, for you, that's more real than anything in my old life." Emma's eyes filled with tears. Why? Was this some kind of social experiment? A way to feel good about yourself by playing at being poor? No. The force of his response made her jump slightly. I was suffocating in my old life. Everything was surface, nothing had meaning. Then I saw you with those children at the library, and for the first time in years, I saw something genuine, something that mattered. So you decided to lie to me? To everyone. I knew if I came as Thomas Preston, CEO, everything would be different. The walls would go up, the relationships wouldn't be real. I needed to know if I could connect with people without my wealth and status getting in the way. Emma was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the continuing rainfall. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with hurt and disappointment. You didn't trust me enough to make that choice for myself. You decided who I was, what I would think, how I would react. That's not love, Thomas, that's control. She turned toward the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. The fundraiser is next weekend. Richard has already promised to match all donations. I suppose that's what real money can do. No need for pretend farming and community markets. Before Thomas could respond, she was gone, disappearing into the rain. He stood at the window, watching her figure grow smaller in the distance, feeling as though everything meaningful he'd built was washing away with the storm. The week following Emma's discovery of his true identity was the longest of Thomas's life. The library, once a sanctuary of warmth and possibility, now felt like forbidden territory. He watched from his window as children and parents entered and left, missing the simple joy of reading stories and helping with homework. His garden continued to flourish, indifferent to his personal turmoil. Every morning he tended to the plants mechanically, remembering Emma's delight at each new sprout and harvest. The vegetables he'd grown with such care now seemed to mock him with their authenticity. They, at least, were exactly what they appeared to be. News of his true identity spread quickly through the tight-knit community. Maria was the only one who still spoke to him, appearing one morning with her usual directness. "So you're some big-shot CEO," she said, inspecting his tomato plants. "These are still growing well. Plants don't care about bank accounts or corporate titles." Thomas managed a weak smile. "I'm sorry I wasn't honest with you, Maria." She straightened up, fixing him with a penetrating stare. "You know what I think? I think you were more honest as a fake farmer than most people are in their real lives. I've seen how you care for these plants, how you treat people. Money doesn't teach that." Her words provided little comfort as Thomas struggled with the collapse of the life he'd built. His corporate phone buzzed constantly now. Word had gotten out about his whereabouts and the board was demanding his return. The business press was having a field day with stories about the CEO who became a farmer. One evening, as Thomas sat in his garden watching the sunset, Victoria Martinez appeared at his gate. Her expression was unreadable as she surveyed his modest home and thriving garden. "May I come in, Mr. Preston?" she asked, emphasizing his real name. "I believe we need to talk." Thomas nodded, leading her to the small garden table. Victoria sat primly, looking decidedly out of place among the vegetable beds and herb planters. "I must admit," she began, "when Richard first showed me the evidence of your true identity, I was rather surprised. The CEO of Preston Tech Industries playing at being a humble farmer. It seemed absurd." "It wasn't playing," Thomas replied, quietly. "Everything I've done here has been real." "Perhaps," Victoria acknowledged, running a finger along the wooden table's surface. "But you must understand how this appears to everyone. To Emma. She trusted you completely." "I never meant to hurt her," Thomas said, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "I fell in love with her because of who she is, not as part of some game." Victoria was quiet for a moment, studying him with the same intense gaze. Emma sometimes had. "You know, when Emma first told me she was giving up a promising teaching career to run that little library, I thought she was making a terrible mistake. I couldn't understand why anyone would choose such a modest life when they could have so much more." She paused, looking out over the garden. "But then I saw how she came alive in that place, how she built something meaningful from nothing. Still didn't agree with her choice, but I had to respect her dedication to what she believed in. Thomas waited, sensing there was more to come. "And now here you are," Victoria continued, "a man who has everything I always wanted for my daughter, choosing to live like this. It's rather ironic, don't you think?" "I didn't understand what real value was until I came here," Thomas admitted. "My whole life was about accumulating wealth, power, status, but watching Emma with those children, seeing how she poured her heart into making their lives better, it showed me what truly matters." Victoria stood, smoothing her designer skirt. "The fundraiser is this Saturday. Emma has been working herself to exhaustion, trying to prove she doesn't need your money to make the library succeed. Richard has been particularly attentive, of course." The thought of Richard taking advantage of the situation made Thomas's jaw clench, but Victoria wasn't finished. "You know, Mr. Preston, I've spent my life believing that success meant a certain lifestyle, certain choices. But perhaps I've been as blind as you were before you came here. The question is, what are you going to do now that everyone knows who you really are?" She turned to leave, but paused at the garden gate. "Emma will be at the community center early Saturday morning, setting up for the fundraiser. She always did prefer to work alone when she's upset." With that parting comment, she left Thomas alone with his thoughts. Inside his house, Thomas looked around at the simple furnishings he'd chosen for his new life. On the kitchen counter sat the morning's harvest, tomatoes, peppers, and herbs he'd grown himself. His laptop showed dozens of missed calls and emails from his corporate life, all demanding his attention. For the first time since Emma had discovered his secret, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. He'd been so focused on maintaining his false identity that he'd lost sight of why he'd created it in the first place. He didn't need to choose between being Thomas Preston and Tom Parker. He could be both, taking the best parts of each life and building something new. As the last light faded from the sky, Thomas began to form a plan. He'd made a terrible mistake in lying to Emma and the community, but perhaps he could find a way to make things right. Not with money or power, but with the same authenticity and dedication that had drawn him to this neighborhood in the first place. He worked late into the night, making calls and arrangements, his garden visible through the window as a reminder of what was real and true in his life. Saturday morning would be his last chance to prove to Emma that while his identity had been false, his heart never was. Saturday morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect weather for the library fundraiser. Thomas arrived at the community center before sunrise, his truck loaded with not just vegetables from his garden, but everything he needed for his plan. He'd been up most of the night, ensuring every detail was perfect. As Victoria had predicted, Emma was already there, arranging tables and setting up displays. She froze when she saw him, her arms full of donated books. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I'd like to help," Thomas replied simply. Not as Thomas Preston, the CEO, or Tom Parker, the farmer, but just as someone who cares about this place and these people, and you. Emma's expression remained guarded, but she didn't ask him to leave. Thomas took that as permission to start unloading his truck. He worked quietly, setting up his produce stand just as he had at the farmer's market, but with one key difference. This time, a simple sign proclaimed "From our community garden," instead of any individual name. As other vendors and volunteers began arriving, Thomas noticed the whispers and stares. News of his true identity had spread throughout the neighborhood, and people who had once greeted him warmly now kept their distance. Even the children who had loved learning about gardening watched him uncertainly from afar. Richard arrived mid-morning, impeccably dressed as always. He made a show of presenting Emma with a large check, his voice carrying across the gathering crowd. "Just a small token of support for your wonderful work," he announced, shooting a triumphant look in Thomas's direction. But Thomas remained focused on his task. One by one, he began inviting the children who had helped in his garden to come forward and explain to visitors about the vegetables they had helped grow. Sophia, the young girl who loved the secret garden, was the first to break ranks. "Mr. Tom taught us about tomatoes," she announced proudly to anyone who would listen. "We planted them from tiny seeds and look how big they got." Her enthusiasm proved contagious, and gradually other children joined in, their natural honesty, cutting through the adult world's complications. As the morning progressed, Thomas implemented the next phase of his plan. Maria arrived with other members of the farmers' cooperative, each bringing supplies for a new initiative, a series of mobile garden boxes that could be installed at schools and community centers throughout the neighborhood. The idea came from Tom, Maria announced to the gathering crowd. Or Thomas, or whatever his name is. He designed these boxes so every child can learn to grow food, no matter where they live. Emma watched from across the room as Thomas worked with the children to plant the first seedlings in the demonstration box. His hands were dirty, his clothes were far from designer quality, and his smile was genuine as he explained the process to his young audience. Victoria appeared at her daughter's side. "You know, dear, I've been thinking about what real wealth means. That man over there might be a CEO, but he chose to get his hands dirty and make a real difference in people's lives. That's worth something." "He lied to me, Mom," Emma replied, but her voice lacked its former conviction. "Yes, he did," Victoria agreed, "but look at what he's doing now. He's not trying to buy his way back into everyone's good graces. He's continuing the work he started, being the person he discovered he could be here." The fundraiser reached its peak around noon. Richard took the microphone, clearly preparing to make some sort of grand announcement, but Thomas beat him to standing next to the demonstration garden box, surrounded by eager children. He finally spoke his truth. "My name is Thomas Preston," he began, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "Many of you knew me as Tom Parker, and I owe you all an apology for that deception. But while my name was false, everything else was real. The garden, the work at the library, my commitment to this community." He looked directly at Emma as he continued. "I came here because I had everything society says should make a person happy. But I felt empty inside. Then I saw this incredible woman teaching children that books could open new worlds, and I witnessed a community that valued people for who they were, not what they owned." Thomas gestured to the garden box beside him. "I learned more about real value working in my garden and helping at the library than I ever did in a corporate boardroom. So today, I'm announcing that Preston Tech Industries will be establishing a foundation to support community libraries and urban farming initiatives across the city. But not as a way to throw money at problems. We'll be providing resources, training and support to help communities grow their own solutions." He paused, then added softly, "I know this doesn't make up for my dishonesty, but I hope it shows that the person you all knew, the one who cared about this community and wanted to make a difference, that person was real. He still is." The community center fell silent as Thomas's words hung in the air. Emma stood perfectly still, tears gathering in her eyes as she looked at the man who had entered her life as a simple farmer and turned everything upside down. The question was, could she trust him again? The silence following Thomas's speech was broken by Sophia's clear voice. "Does this mean you won't be teaching us about gardening anymore, Mr. Tom?" The simple question from the child seemed to cut through the tension in the room. Thomas knelt, down to her level, something he'd learned from watching Emma with the children at the library. "I'll always be here to teach you about gardening, Sophia. That's a promise." He looked up to find Emma watching their interaction, her expression unreadable, but softened somehow. Richard stepped forward, his polished demeanor slightly ruffled. "This is all very touching, but let's not forget that Mr. Preston spent months deceiving everyone here. How can anyone trust his promises now?" Maria, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Trust is earned through actions, not words or money. And I've seen this man's actions every day at the market, working harder than anyone despite having millions in the bank. That means something to me." Other vendors and community members began sharing their own experiences, how Thomas had helped them set up their stalls in the rain, taught their children about fresh vegetables, or contributed ideas to improve the market's organization. Each story revealed a piece of the real person behind both Thomas Preston and Tom Parker. Emma remained silent, but Thomas noticed her watching intently as more people spoke up. Victoria stood beside her daughter, no longer radiating disapproval, but instead showing genuine interest in the community's response. As the fundraiser continued, Thomas threw himself into demonstrating the garden boxes, working alongside the children and their parents. He didn't try to approach Emma directly, understanding that she needed time to process everything. Near one of the display tables, he overheard Richard speaking urgently to Victoria. "This is clearly a publicity stunt. Once he gets what he wants, he'll disappear back to his corporate world and leave everyone here disappointed. Emma deserves better than that." "Perhaps," Victoria replied thoughtfully, "but I've never seen anyone work this hard for a publicity stunt. Look at his hands, Richard. Those calluses aren't fake." Throughout the afternoon, Thomas noticed small changes in how people approached him. The initial shock and betrayal began to give way to curiosity and cautious acceptance. Parents who had pulled their children away earlier now allowed them to participate in the gardening demonstrations. Even some of the library's regular patrons began to engage with him again, asking questions about his plans for the foundation and sharing their ideas for community programs. Thomas listened earnestly to every suggestion, taking notes and treating each contribution with genuine respect. Emma spent most of the day coordinating the library's book sale section, but Thomas occasionally caught her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. Once their eyes met across the room, and for a brief moment, he saw a flicker of the warmth that had once been there. As the event began winding down, Sophia approached Emma with a small potted herb plant she had grown with Thomas's guidance. "Miss Emma, Mr. Tom taught me how to grow this. He says it's called basil and it's good for making spaghetti sauce. Can we keep it in the library? Maybe near the cooking books?" Emma accepted the plant, her fingers brushing the fragrant leaves. "That's a wonderful idea, Sophia. Every time we water it, we can learn something new about how plants grow." Thomas overheard the exchange as he cleaned up his demonstration area. He didn't look up, but he could feel Emma's presence lingering nearby. "You're good with them," she said finally, her voice soft. "The children. That was never part of the act, was it?" Thomas met her eyes. "None of it was an act, Emma. The name was false, but everything else, every moment, every feeling, every connection, it was all real." Emma studied the basil plant in her hands. "I used to think I knew exactly what mattered in life. Teaching, books, helping others. Everything was clear. Then you came along and made me question things I never thought I'd question." "I'm sorry," Thomas began, but Emma held up her hand. "Let me finish. You made me question things, yes, but you also showed me that sometimes what seems simple on the surface can have deeper meaning. These past months, watching you work in your garden, help at the library, connect with the community, that was real impact, real change, not just throwing money at problems." She paused, absently touching one of the basil leaves. "I'm still hurt that you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth, but I'm beginning to understand why you felt you couldn't." Before Thomas could respond, Richard appeared with several volunteers ready to dismantle the displays. Emma moved away to help, but not before giving Thomas one last look that held more questions than answers. As the sun began to set, Thomas loaded the last of his equipment into his truck. The community center was almost empty now, but the energy of the day lingered in the air. He had shown everyone who he truly was, not just Thomas Preston, the Bay, CEO, or Tom Parker, the farmer, but the person he had become through his time in this community. The foundation announcement had been well received, but he knew that wasn't enough. Trust, once broken, had to be rebuilt slowly, deliberately, with consistent actions rather than grand gestures. As he prepared to drive home, Thomas realized that this was just the beginning of a much longer journey, one that would require patience, dedication, and above all, complete honesty. The week following the fundraiser brought subtle but significant changes to the neighborhood. Thomas's garden became a gathering spot for children after school, their parents gradually overcoming their initial hesitation. He maintained his regular schedule at the farmer's market, now under his real name but with the same dedication to the community. The foundation announcement had attracted media attention, but Thomas deliberately kept a low profile, focusing instead on the practical aspects of implementing his plans. He spent hours in meetings with community leaders, listening to their needs and ideas rather than imposing his own vision. One morning, as Thomas worked in his garden, he heard familiar footsteps approaching. Emma stood at his gate, holding 2 cups of coffee, just as she had done in what felt like another lifetime. "I thought you might need this," she said, offering him one of the cups. Old habits die hard, I guess. Thomas accepted the coffee, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Thank you. Would you like to see how the new seedlings are doing? Emma nodded, following him through the neat rows of vegetables. They walked in comfortable silence, the morning sun warming the earth around them. Finally, Emma spoke. I've been thinking about what you said at the fundraiser, about learning more in your garden than in your boardroom. It's true, Thomas replied, gently checking a tomato plant. In business, success is measured in quarterly reports and stock prices. Here, success means watching something grow, helping it thrive. You can't rush it or fake it. Like trust? Emma's question was soft but direct. Thomas straightened up, meeting her gaze. Yes, exactly like trust. I know I have to earn it back, not just with you, but with everyone. I'm prepared to take as long as that requires. Mom told me something interesting yesterday, Emma said, running her fingers along a row of herbs. She said she finally understands why I chose the library over a traditional teaching career. Apparently, seeing you choose this life despite having everything she thinks is important made her question her own assumptions. Victoria is more perceptive than I gave her credit for, Thomas admitted. She also said that Richard has been pressing her to convince me to accept a position at his law firm's charitable foundation. Apparently it would be more suitable than running a small community library. Thomas felt his jaw tighten, but kept his voice neutral. What did you tell her? I told her that I've learned the difference between doing something that looks important and doing something that is important. Emma looked around the garden thoughtfully, kind of like the difference between being successful and being fulfilled. A group of children appeared at the garden gate, their backpacks still on, from school. Mr. Tom, Sophia called out, can we check on our plants? Emma smiled at their enthusiasm. I should get back to the library. We're starting a new reading program today. The one about connecting books with real-world experiences? Thomas asked, remembering their discussions from before everything had changed. You remembered, Emma said, surprised. Yes, that's the one. Actually, she hesitated, then continued, we could use some help with the science and nature sections, someone who knows about plants and growing things, if you're interested. Thomas understood the olive branch for what it was, not forgiveness exactly, but an opportunity to rebuild trust through actions rather than words. I'd like that, he replied simply. As Emma left, the children swarmed into the garden, eager to show her their growing plants. Thomas watched her walk away, noticing how she paused at the gate to look back at the scene of him surrounded by excited young gardeners. Later that afternoon, Thomas visited the library for the first time since his identity had been revealed. The atmosphere was different. Some patrons whispered and stared, while others made a point of greeting him normally. He focused on the task at hand, helping Emma organize books for the new program. They worked together efficiently, their former rhythm still there beneath the surface tension. As they shelved books about plant life and ecology, Emma broke their comfortable silence. You know, when I first started this library, everyone told me I was making a mistake, that I was wasting my potential. But I knew that creating something meaningful, even if it was small, mattered more than having an impressive title or salary. You inspired me, Thomas admitted. Watching you fight for what you believed in, seeing the impact you had on people's lives, it showed me what I'd been missing. Emma placed the last book on the shelf, her hand lingering on its spine. I thought I had you figured out, first as the humble farmer, then as the deceptive millionaire. But maybe the truth is somewhere in between. I'm still figuring out who I am, Thomas said honestly, but I know who I want to be. And that person is someone who contributes to this community, who helps things grow, who makes a real difference in people's lives, with or without the money and the title. A young patron approached with a question about gardening books, and Thomas watched as Emma slipped easily back into her role as librarian, guiding the child with her characteristic patience and enthusiasm. In that moment, he realized that rebuilding trust wasn't just about grand gestures or public declarations. It was about showing up, day after day, and proving through consistent actions that you were worthy of it. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures to the neighborhood, Thomas's foundation plans began taking concrete shape. The first wave of garden boxes had been installed at 3 local schools, with the library serving as a central hub for educational programs. The media attention had mostly died down, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of seeing real progress in the community. However, not everyone was pleased with these developments. Richard had become increasingly aggressive in his opposition, using his legal connections to create bureaucratic obstacles for the foundation's initiatives. One morning, as Thomas helped set up the farmers' market, Maria approached him with concern, etched on her face. "The city council's giving us trouble about the market permits," she said, her weathered hands twisting her apron. "Apparently, someone's filed a complaint about health and safety regulations. They're threatening to shut us down." Thomas didn't need to ask who was behind it. "Let me handle this, Maria. I know how to navigate city bureaucracy." "Just don't throw money at it," she warned. "That's not how we do things here." Her words struck home. Thomas had been careful to balance his resources with the community's values, understanding that simply writing checks wouldn't solve every problem and might create new ones. At the library later that day, Emma was dealing with her own challenges. The new reading program had been so successful that they were running out of space and resources. Thomas found her surrounded by stacks of books, trying to reorganize the limited shelf space. "Need a hand?" he offered, already rolling up his sleeves. Emma pushed back a loose strand of hair, looking exhausted but determined. "We need more than hands. We're victims of our own success. More children are coming every day, which is wonderful, but we can barely keep up. Have you considered expanding?" Thomas asked carefully, aware that his suggestions about using resources were still a sensitive topic. "The building next door has been empty for months," Emma admitted, "but the rent is way beyond our budget, and I won't have the library lose its independence by becoming too reliant on foundation money." Before Thomas could respond, Victoria appeared in the doorway. "Emma, dear, I've been thinking about the space issue." She paused, noting Thomas's presence with a slight nod. "What if we converted the old family store?" Emma's eyes widened. The Martinez family's former hardware store had been sitting unused since Emma's grandfather retired years ago. Victoria had always refused to sell it, calling it her insurance policy for Emma's future. "Mom, are you serious? But you've always said—" "I've said a lot of things," Victoria interrupted, her voice softer than usual. "But I've been watching what's happening here. The children, the community, the changes. Maybe it's time to let go of old expectations." Emma hugged her mother impulsively, tears in her eyes. Thomas stepped back, giving them space for their moment, but Victoria called him over. "Mr. Preston, Thomas, I assume your foundation knows something about renovating old buildings." "We do," he replied carefully. "But the community would need to be involved in any decisions. This place means something to everyone here." Victoria nodded approvingly. "Good answer." "Emma," Richard called again about the foundation position. "I told him you're already running something more important than a corporate charity program." The moment was interrupted by Sophia bursting into the library, clutching a newspaper. "Miss Emma, Mr. Tom, look, they wrote about our garden boxes." The article was positive, focusing on the community's involvement and the educational impact of the program. But there was a quote from Richard, suggesting that the initiative was a billionaire's attempt to buy goodwill after deceiving an entire neighborhood. Emma took the paper from Sophia, her expression hardening as she read. "He just won't let it go, will he?" "He's not entirely wrong," Thomas said quietly. "I did deceive everyone. His suspicion is understandable." "No," Emma replied firmly. "He's not suspicious. He's bitter. There's a difference between being cautious about trust and actively trying to destroy something good." Victoria examined the article thoughtfully. Richard was always like this, even as a child. If he couldn't control something, he'd rather see it fail than succeed without him. As if summoned by their discussion, Richard appeared in the library doorway, his expression triumphant. "Emma, I thought you should know the City Council's reviewing all recent zoning changes in this area, including the permits for these garden boxes." Thomas felt his hands clench, but kept his voice level. "The foundation's paperwork is in order, Richard. Everything was done properly. We'll see about that, Richard smiled coldly. Oh, and Emma? The offer to join my firm's foundation still stands. Unlike some people's promises, it comes with genuine security and respectability. After he left, the library fell into an uncomfortable silence. Sophia, who had been quietly arranging books nearby, spoke up. Mr. Tom, is someone going to take away our garden boxes? Thomas knelt beside her. No, Sophia. I promise you that won't happen. Because you're rich and powerful? She asked innocently. No, Thomas replied, meeting Emma's eyes across the room. Because when a community works together to build something good, it's stronger than any individual's money or power. As the day wound down, Thomas and Emma sat on the library steps, watching the sunset. The autumn air was crisp with possibility. You could crush him, you know, Emma said quietly. With your resources, your connection, I could, Thomas acknowledged. But that would make me exactly what he claims I am, someone who uses power and money to get his way. This has to be handled differently. Emma's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. We'll figure it out. Together. The following. Weeks brought both challenges and unexpected allies. As Richard's legal maneuvers threatened the market and garden box program, the community rallied in ways that surprised everyone, especially Thomas. Local business owners, many of whom had initially been skeptical of Thomas after his revelation, began speaking up at city council meetings. They shared stories about increased foot traffic, improved community engagement, and the positive impact of the farmers' market on the neighborhood's economy. Maria organized the market vendors into a formal association, strengthening their position with the city. We're not just individual sellers anymore, she declared at their first official meeting. We're a community institution. The library had become the unofficial headquarters for their efforts. Emma's organizational skills and Thomas's business experience combined to create strategies that went beyond simple financial solutions. They worked side by side, their personal relationship gradually healing through their shared commitment to the community. One evening, as they reviewed paperwork for the Martinez store renovation, Emma looked up at Thomas with a slight smile. You know what I realized today? When I first met you, the farmer you, I was attracted to your authenticity, your commitment to simple, meaningful work. I thought I'd lost that person when I found out who you really were. Thomas set down his papers, giving her his full attention. But watching you these past weeks, she continued, fighting for the market, working with the community, finding solutions that don't rely on just throwing money around. I realized that person was real. He just had more layers than I initially understood. Before Thomas could respond, Sophia's mother burst into the library, clearly agitated. Miss Emma, Mr. Tom, they're taking down the garden box at the school. They rushed to the elementary school, where a city works crew was preparing to remove the garden box that Thomas's foundation had installed. Richard stood nearby, supervising with barely concealed satisfaction. What's going on here? Thomas demanded, though he kept his voice calm. Just enforcing city regulations, Richard replied smoothly. These structures were installed without proper permits. As a concerned citizen, I felt obligated to report it. A crowd began gathering, parents, teachers, and children who had been tending the garden. Sophia pushed through to the front, tears in her eyes. Please don't take our garden, she pleaded with the workers. We're learning about science with it, and we grew tomatoes for Mrs. Johnson when she was sick. Other children joined in, sharing stories about what the garden meant to them. Parents spoke up about how the program had changed their children's eating habits and interest in science. The work crew looked increasingly uncomfortable. Their supervisor checked his paperwork, then approached Richard. Sir, these removal orders, they seem unnecessarily rushed. Usually there's a review period. The orders are legal, Richard insisted. Proceed with the removal. Actually, a new voice interrupted. They're not. Everyone turned to see Victoria Martinez approaching, accompanied by an elderly man, whom Thomas recognized as a senior member of the city council. Councilman Chen and I have been having some interesting discussions about community development, Victoria announced. It seems these garden boxes fall under the city's new educational initiative guidelines. They're completely legal. with all proper permits in place. Richard's face reddened. That's impossible. I checked all the regulations. The new guidelines were approved last month, Councilman Chen explained mildly. Mrs. Martinez was quite persuasive about their importance to the community. Victoria smiled slightly. I may not have always understood the value of community projects, but I know how to navigate city politics. Consider it my contribution to my daughter's chosen work. The work crew quickly packed up their equipment and left. As the crowd celebrated, Emma turned to her mother in amazement. "Mom, I can't believe you did this." "Well," Victoria sniffed, though her eyes were warm, "I couldn't very well let someone destroy my grandchildren's future garden, could I?" Thomas raised an eyebrow at her choice of words, but Emma was already hugging her mother tightly. Richard stood alone now, his victory evaporated. Thomas approached him quietly. "You know, Richard, there's room in this community for everyone who genuinely wants to contribute. Your legal skills could do a lot of good here." "Save your magnanimous gestures," Richard snapped. "You may have won this round, but this isn't about winning," Thomas interrupted. "It's about building something worthwhile. Think about it." As Richard stalked away, Emma slipped her hand into Thomas's. Around them, parents and children were already checking on their plants, ensuring nothing had been damaged. "You meant that, didn't you?" Emma asked. "About Richard?" "I did," Thomas replied. "I've learned that real strength isn't about defeating others. It's about creating space for everyone to grow." Sophia appeared before them, holding up a slightly squashed tomato. "Look what I saved. Can we plant the seeds for next spring?" Thomas and Emma exchanged glances, both thinking about the future implied in the child's simple question. "Yes," they answered together. "Next spring will be even better." The renovation of the old Martinez hardware store began as autumn deepened into winter. The entire community became involved in the transformation, with local craftspeople offering their skills alongside Thomas's foundation resources. Emma spent every spare moment planning the new library space, her excitement growing with each completed phase. One cold morning, as Thomas helped clear out decades of accumulated hardware store inventory, he discovered a dusty photo album tucked away on a high shelf. Inside were pictures of a much younger Victoria, standing proudly beside her father in front of the newly opened store. "Dad believed in building things that last," Emma said softly, appearing beside him. She gently took the album, running her fingers over the old photographs. "That's why Mom held on to this place for so long. It wasn't just about the money. It was about preserving his legacy." "And now it's becoming something new," Thomas observed, watching workers install large windows designed to flood the space with natural light. "But still building something lasting." Emma's eyes sparkled with unshed tears. "I think he would have loved this, especially the children's reading nook we're planning for the old tool section." Their moment was interrupted by Sophia and several other children arriving for their now regular after-school session. Despite the winter weather, the Garden Box program had evolved to include indoor growing projects and educational workshops. "Miss Emma, Mr. Tom," Sophia called out excitedly. "We got the results from our science fair project." The children had entered their Garden Box experiments in the district science fair, documenting the growth rates of different plants and their impact on student engagement. Their enthusiasm for learning had impressed the judges. "First place," Sophia announced proudly, holding up the certificate. "And guess what? The principal wants to expand the program to all the grades." Thomas watched as Emma gathered the children around, her face glowing with pride as they shared their experiences. This was what real success looked like, not stock prices or corporate acquisitions, but the genuine joy of young minds discovering their potential. Victoria arrived later that afternoon, carrying boxes of old business records to sort through. She paused in the doorway, taking in the transformation of her family's store. "You know," she said to Thomas as they worked together, "when Emma first told me about turning this place into a library extension, I thought she was being impractical, just like when she gave up her private school position." She carefully folded an old invoice lost in memory. "My father always said that true value isn't in what you sell but in what you build. I thought I understood that." but I was too focused on building wealth instead of worth. It's an easy mistake to make, Thomas replied, thinking of his own journey. Society measures success in dollars and status. Indeed, Victoria smiled wryly, which is why watching you choose this life, despite having all that success, made me question my own definitions of value. You and Emma, you're building something real here. The conversation was interrupted by Maria bursting in, her face flushed with excitement. You won't believe what just happened at the market meeting. She explained that Richard had appeared at the Farmers Market Association gathering, not to create problems, but to offer legal help in establishing the market as a permanent community fixture. He said something about wanting to contribute in a meaningful way, Maria reported, still sounding surprised. Asked if we could use pro bono legal services. Emma, who had been listening nearby, shared a knowing look with Thomas. People can surprise you, she said softly. Sometimes they just need to be given the chance to be part of something bigger than themselves. As the day progressed, Thomas found himself working alongside community members who had once viewed him with suspicion. They shared stories, swapped ideas for the new space, and planned future projects. The boundaries between his old life and new had begun to blur, creating something richer and more authentic than either extreme. During a break, he found Emma in what would become the new library's main reading room. She stood by the windows, watching the winter sun cast long shadows across the floor. What are you thinking about? He asked, joining her. About how things change, she replied. When I started the library, I thought I knew exactly what it would be. Small, manageable, focused, but it's grown into something so much more, just like your garden. Thomas understood the parallel she was drawing. Life has a way of expanding beyond our careful plans. Yes, Emma agreed, turning to face him. Sometimes the best things grow from unexpected seeds. She paused, a slight smile playing at her lips. Like falling in love with someone who turns out to be completely different from who you thought they were, but exactly who you needed them to be. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the community at work, hammers and saws, children's laughter, conversations and plans being made. Their world had grown larger and more complex than either had imagined, but it had also grown richer and more meaningful. Sophia appeared in the doorway, clutching a stack of seed catalogs. Can we start planning the spring garden? I have so many ideas, Emma laughed, reaching for Thomas's hand. Speaking of unexpected growth, together they joined Sophia at one of the newly installed tables, spreading out the catalogs and beginning to plan for another season of possibility. The weeks leading up to Christmas transformed the neighborhood. Despite the cold, the community's warmth seemed to grow stronger. The farmers' market had moved indoors to the community center, where Thomas and other vendors now sold winter vegetables grown in temporary greenhouses they'd built together. The renovation of the Martinez store was nearly complete, with only finishing touches remaining. The space had been reimagined as a modern community library, while preserving touches of its hardware store heritage. Old wooden shelves had been repurposed for books, and vintage tools were displayed as art pieces, connecting past and present. One snowy evening, as Thomas and Emma worked late organizing the new space, they discovered an old ledger from the store's early days. Emma's grandfather had meticulously recorded not just sales, but stories, notes about customers, their needs, their lives. Look at this, Emma said, pointing to an entry. Mrs. Rodriguez needed hinges for her kitchen cabinets. Couldn't afford full price, worked out payment plan. Her boy Miguel helped sweep the store Saturday mornings. He didn't just run a business, he built relationships. That's what you're doing here, Thomas observed. The library isn't just about books. It's about connecting people, building community. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. To their surprise, it was Richard, looking somewhat uncomfortable but determined. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said, stepping inside and stamping snow from his shoes. I wanted to drop off these legal documents for the Market Association. He paused, taking in the transformed space. This is impressive. Would you like a tour? Emma offered, her tone friendly but careful. As they showed him around, Richard's professional facade began to crack. I remember coming here as a kid, he admitted. Mr. Martinez always had time to explain how things worked, what tools were for. He taught me how to fix my first bicycle in that corner over there. Thomas watched as Emma shared their plans for each section of the new library, noting how Richard's expressions shifted from skepticism to genuine interest. When they reached the area designated for legal resources and community education, Richard stopped. "You're planning to offer legal literacy workshops. We want to help people understand their rights, navigate basic legal processes," Emma explained. "But we need someone with expertise to guide the program." Richard was quiet for a moment, studying the space. I might know some people who could help with that." Later, after Richard had left, Emma turned to Thomas with a thoughtful expression. "You knew, didn't you? That's why you kept leaving the door open for him to be involved." "Everyone needs to feel they have something valuable to contribute," Thomas replied. "I learned that from you." The next morning brought the first major snowfall of the season. Thomas arrived at the library to find Sophia and other children pressed against the windows, watching the flakes swirl down. "Mr. Tom," Sophia called out, "can we still grow things in the winter?" "Actually," Thomas smiled, "I have something to show you." He led the children to a corner of the new library where he and Emma had set up a special surprise, a small indoor growing station with lights and shelves. "This is where we'll learn about year-round growing. Even in winter, life finds a way to flourish." As the children gathered around, excitedly examining the setup, Victoria appeared with hot chocolate for everyone. She'd taken to spending more time at the library, gradually shifting from skeptic to enthusiastic supporter. "I've been thinking," she announced, watching the children sip their hot chocolate. "The Foundation's educational programs shouldn't be limited to just this neighborhood. Other communities could benefit from what you've built here." Emma looked up from helping Sophia plant winter herbs. "Mum, are you suggesting we expand?" "I'm suggesting," Victoria replied carefully, "that what you and Thomas have created here is too valuable to keep to ourselves. But," she added with a glowing smile, "expansion doesn't mean losing what makes this place special." Thomas and Emma exchanged glances, both remembering their own journeys from rigid expectations to broader possibilities. The library had grown beyond either of their original visions, just as their relationship had deepened beyond their first impressions. As evening approached, Thomas found Emma in the reading nook, surrounded by books waiting to be shelved. Through the windows, they could see the snow continuing to fall, coating the neighborhood in a pristine blanket of white. "Your mother's right," Thomas said softly. "What we've built here could help other communities, but this will always be where it started, where I found what I was really looking for." Emma stood, crossing to join him at the window. "And what was that? Purpose, connection, the chance to build something real." He turned to face her. "The courage to be honest about who I am and what matters to me." Outside, the last light of day painted the snowy scene in soft golds and blues. Inside, surrounded by books and the promise of spring's renewal, they stood together, watching their community transform under winter's quiet blessing. As winter began to release its grip on the neighborhood, the new library space buzzed with activity. The grand opening was scheduled for the first day of spring, a symbolism that wasn't lost on anyone. Thomas and Emma had been working tirelessly, ensuring every detail was perfect. One morning, as Thomas helped install the final shelving units, he overheard a conversation between Emma and Sophia that made him pause. "Miss Emma," Sophia asked, arranging books in the children's section, "are you and Mr. Tom going to get married?" Emma's startled laugh carried through the space. "Sophia, that's quite a personal question." "But you love each other," Sophia persisted with a child's directness. "And he makes you smile like my mom smiles at my dad. Plus, he knows about books and gardens. That's pretty perfect." Thomas smiled to himself, continuing his work, but listening intently to Emma's response. "Life isn't always that simple, sweetheart," Emma replied gently. "Sometimes people need time to grow together, like your garden plants. You can't rush it." "But the plants do grow," Sophia pointed out with impeccable logic, "as long as you take care of them properly." Later that day, Victoria arrived with lunch for everyone working on the final preparations. She'd become a regular presence, seamlessly blending her organizational skills with the community's more casual approach. "The City Council approved our proposal for the summer reading program," she announced, setting out sandwiches. "And Richard's legal team has finished drafting the partnership agreements for the other neighborhoods interested in starting similar programs." Thomas watched as Emma's face lit up at the news. She'd been hoping to share their success with other communities, but wanted to ensure it was done thoughtfully, maintaining the grassroots spirit that made their program special. "That's wonderful, Mom, but how did you get them to move so quickly?" "These things usually take months." Victoria's eyes twinkled. "Let's just say I reminded them of the positive press they've received from our initiative. Sometimes a little strategic thinking goes a long way." As they ate lunch, community members dropped by with various contributions for the opening ceremony: handmade decorations, baked goods, and even musical instruments for the children's performance they'd planned. Maria arrived with a special delivery. The first seedlings started in their new greenhouse, ready to be distributed to the schools and community gardens as part of the spring program. "These little ones are fighters," she said proudly, showing them the strong, healthy plants. "Just like our community, no matter what challenges come, we keep growing." Thomas caught Emma's eye across the room, both of them thinking of how far they'd come from their first meeting. The lies and misunderstandings that had once threatened to tear them apart had instead forced them to build something stronger, more authentic. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas found himself in the quiet of his garden, taking a moment to reflect. The winter vegetables were nearly finished, making way for spring planting. Sophia and her friends had already helped him prepare the soil, their excitement for the new growing season infectious. Emma found him there carrying 2 cups of coffee, their ritual that had survived all the changes in their relationship. "Penny, for your thoughts?" she asked, settling beside him on the garden bench. "I was just thinking about transformation," he replied, accepting the coffee. "How sometimes we have to let things be still, even appear dormant, before new growth can happen." Emma nodded, understanding the metaphor, like how a successful CEO had to become a humble farmer to find his true purpose, or how a dedicated teacher had to trust her instincts and build something entirely new, he added softly. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last patches of snow melt in the lengthening daylight. The garden held the promise of spring in its dark earth, just as their relationship held the promise of something deeper, stronger than either had initially imagined. "Sophia asked me an interesting question today," Emma said finally, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "I heard," Thomas admitted. "She makes some compelling points about gardening and relationships." Emma turned to face him, her expression serious but tender. "She does, doesn't she? About taking care of things and letting them grow naturally." Before Thomas could respond, they heard voices approaching. The afternoon volunteer group was arriving to help with the final preparations for the opening. The moment passed, but something had shifted, like the first subtle signs of spring beneath the winter soil. As they walked back to the library together, Thomas noticed Richard's car parked outside. Inside, they found him working with a group of high school students, explaining basic legal concepts as part of their new civic education program. "The law exists to protect and serve the community," he was saying, his usual corporate demeanor softened by genuine engagement. "Understanding your rights and responsibilities is the first step to being an active citizen." Emma squeezed Thomas's hand gently. "Speaking of transformation," she whispered. The day continued with a flurry of activity, books to be shelved, programs to be finalized, last-minute details to be addressed. But throughout it all, Thomas felt a growing certainty about the future, about his place in this community, and about the woman who had helped him discover what really mattered. The week before the library's grand opening brought a special kind of chaos to the neighborhood. Every morning, new faces appeared, reporters curious about the innovative community program, educators interested in replicating their success, and local officials eager to be associated with the positive changes. Thomas had carefully managed the media attention, ensuring it focused on the community's achievements rather than his personal story. But one persistent reporter managed to corner him as he worked in the garden. "Mr. Preston," she called out. "Notepad ready." Some people are calling this a billionaire's redemption story. How do you respond to that? Before Thomas could answer, Sophia's voice piped up from behind the tomato plants. "Mr. Tom isn't a billionaire," she stated matter-of-factly. "He's a gardener who teaches us about growing things and reading books. And he loves Miss Emma." The reporter's expression softened as she watched Sophia carefully checking the plant supports Thomas had taught her to maintain. The story she eventually published focused not on Thomas's wealth or past deception, but on the transformative power of community connection and purpose. Inside the library, Emma was conducting final checks on their new systems when Victoria arrived with an unexpected delivery, a carefully preserved book of pressed flowers. "I found this while clearing out the last of the store records," she explained, handling the delicate volume with care. "Your grandfather made it with your grandmother during their first year of marriage. Every flower came from their garden." Emma traced the dried petals gently. "I remember him telling me about this, how they planned their future while planning their garden." Victoria's eyes were unusually bright. They understood something I forgot somewhere along the way, that the most valuable things in life aren't always the most impressive on paper. Their moment was interrupted by Richard, arriving for a final review of the legal documentation for their expanding programs. He'd thrown himself into the community work with surprising dedication, finding a sense of purpose that had been missing from his corporate practice. "The satellite program agreements are ready," he announced, then paused, noting the emotional atmosphere. "Is everything all right?" "Just remembering," Victoria replied, carefully rewrapping the flower book, "and realizing that sometimes the best future isn't the one we originally planned." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I've been learning that lesson myself." He turned to Emma. "I owe you an apology. I was so focused on what I thought success should look like that I couldn't see the value in what you were building here." Emma's response was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas and Sophia, fresh from the garden, and carrying baskets of early spring vegetables for the opening celebration. "Look what we grew," Sophia announced proudly. "Mr. Tom says these are just the beginning. Wait until you see what's coming in summer." As Sophia excitedly shared their garden plans with Victoria and Richard, Thomas moved to Emma's side, noticing the book of pressed flowers. "Family heirloom?" he asked softly. "A reminder," Emma replied, "that the best gardens, and the best relationships grow from careful tending and patient love." The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. The community came together in ways that surprised even its most dedicated supporters. Local artists painted murals celebrating the neighborhood's history. Children created displays about their garden projects, and families contributed stories about how the program had impacted their lives. One evening, as sunset painted the sky, in spring colors, Thomas found Emma in what had once been her grandfather's office, now transformed into a cozy reading nook. She was holding the book of pressed flowers again, lost in thought. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, joining her by the window. "About growth," she replied. "Not just the plants or the library, but us. How we had to face hard truths and work through them together. How sometimes what seems like an ending can be a beginning." Thomas took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers naturally. "Sophia asked me something interesting today," he said. "She wanted to know if we could plant a forever garden." Emma turned to face him, curiosity in her eyes. "A forever garden?" "Something that would keep growing and changing but always stay strong at its roots." He paused, gathering his courage. "It made me think about us, about the future we could build together." The moment was perfectly interrupted by Sophia bursting in, followed by Victoria and Maria, all talking excitedly about last-minute preparations for the opening. But something had shifted, like the first warm breeze of spring promising changes to come. That night, as Thomas walked home under the stars, he felt a deep sense of certainty. Tomorrow would bring the grand opening, the official beginning of their expanded community program. But it would also bring something else, the perfect moment to ask Emma about planting their own forever garden together. The morning of the library's grand opening dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself was celebrating with them. Thomas arrived early, carrying a special surprise he'd been preparing for weeks. In the quiet before the ceremony, he carefully arranged a display of photographs documenting the community's journey, from the first garden boxes to the library renovation. Emma found him adjusting the final image, a candid shot of Sophia teaching other children how to plant seeds. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "When did you take all these?" "I've been collecting them since the beginning," Thomas replied. "I wanted to show how organic this whole process has been, how one small seed of an idea grew into something so much bigger." They were interrupted by Victoria's arrival, carrying what appeared to be an old wooden box. "Emma, sweetheart, I found something else while cleaning out the storeroom. I think today is the perfect time to share it." Inside the box were dozens of thank you notes, carefully preserved by Emma's grandfather over the years. Each one told a story of how the hardware store had helped someone in need, a delayed payment plan here, a midnight emergency repair there, countless small kindnesses that had built a legacy of community trust. "Your grandfather understood that a business isn't just about transactions," Victoria said softly. "It's about building connections. You and Thomas have honored that legacy in ways I never imagined possible." The first guests began arriving shortly after, and soon the new library space was filled with excitement and anticipation. Children ran around showing their parents the reading nooks they'd helped design, while community members proudly pointed out their contributions to the renovation. Richard arrived wearing casual clothes instead of his usual suit, carrying a stack of legal resources for the community law section. "I've been thinking," he told Emma and Thomas, "maybe it's time I opened a small practice here in the neighborhood. Focus on helping people who really need it." Maria and the other market vendors had set up a spectacular display of local produce and products, demonstrating how the community's economic initiatives had grown alongside the library program. "From seeds to success," Maria announced proudly, "just like you two." As the official ceremony approached, Thomas noticed Sophia and her friends whispering and giggling, occasionally glancing in his and Emma's direction. They seemed to be planning something. But before he could investigate, it was time for the speeches to begin. The mayor spoke first, praising the innovative community development model. Then Victoria surprised everyone by taking the podium. "When my father opened his hardware store here, he had a vision of building more than just a business. Today, my daughter and Thomas Preston have shown us that vision can grow in ways we never expected." Emma's speech focused on the community's achievements, but her eyes kept finding Thomas in the crowd. "We've learned that true growth happens when we're brave enough to be authentic, to admit our mistakes, and to believe in second chances." When it was Thomas's turn to speak, he found himself setting aside his prepared remarks. "A few months ago, I thought I had everything figured out. I had success, wealth, power, all the things society tells us we should want. Then I saw a woman carrying books to a small community library, and my whole world shifted." He paused, looking directly at Emma. "I came here thinking I would teach others about growing things, but this community taught me about growing as a person, about the difference between having value and creating worth, about how love, like a garden, needs truth and trust to flourish." Sophia chose that moment to step forward, carrying a small potted plant. "Mr. Tom and Miss Emma helped us learn that the best things take time to grow," she announced, with the solemn importance only a child can muster. "So we made you something special." The children had created a miniature garden in a decorative pot, combining plants from Thomas's garden with tiny books they'd made themselves. "It's a forever garden," Sophia explained proudly, "because you helped us grow, and now we want to help you grow too." Emma knelt down to examine their creation, tears sparkling in her eyes. The children had carefully labeled each plant with quotes from their favorite books about love, growth, and new beginnings. Thomas joined them, his heart full as he watched Emma trace the carefully written labels. The moment felt perfect, surrounded by their community, celebrating growth and possibility. He reached into his pocket, feeling the small box he'd been carrying for weeks. But before he could act, Sophia spoke up again. "Miss Emma, remember when you said people need time to grow together like garden plants? Well, Mr. Tom has been taking really good care of your love garden. Isn't it time to plant something forever?" The room filled with warm laughter, and Emma's cheeks flushed pink. She looked up at Thomas, who found himself thinking that sometimes the best moments aren't the ones we carefully plan, but the ones that grow naturally from love and truth. Victoria watched the scene unfold with a knowing smile, while Richard nodded approvingly from his place near the community law section. Maria wiped away a tear, muttering something about spring allergies, and the children gathered closer, sensing something special was about to happen. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the space that had once been a hardware store and was now so much more, a testament to growth, change, and the power of authentic connection. Today marked not just the opening of a new library, but the beginning of something even more meaningful. In the warm afternoon following the opening ceremony, the celebration moved outdoors to the community gardens. Tables had been set up among the growing plants laden with food prepared by local families. Children ran between the garden boxes, proudly showing visitors the vegetables they'd helped cultivate. Thomas found himself standing beside the first garden box he'd ever built in the neighborhood, remembering the day Emma had discovered him working in his yard. How far they'd come from that moment of simple curiosity between strangers. "Penny, for your thoughts." Emma's voice came from behind him, accompanied by the familiar offering of coffee. "I was just thinking about beginnings," he replied, turning to face her, "and how sometimes the best ones start with a little deception." Emma laughed softly. "Are you trying to justify lying about being a humble farmer?" "Never," Thomas said seriously. "But I am grateful that my lie led to something true, something real." They were interrupted by Sophia, who appeared with an armful of fresh herbs. "Miss Emma, Mr. Tom, look what we harvested for the celebration." As they helped Sophia arrange her herbs on one of the display tables, Victoria approached with Richard and Maria in tow. "Well," Victoria said, her eyes twinkling, "isn't this a perfect scene? The farmer, the librarian, and their little gardener." Sophia beamed at being included in the description. "And don't forget the forever garden. Mr. Tom said those are the most important kind." Richard cleared his throat. "Speaking of forever, I finished drafting those long-term program agreements you asked for, Thomas, though I suspect there might be some personal agreements to consider as well." Maria swatted his arm. "Always the lawyer. Can't you see they're having a moment?" Indeed, something had shifted in the air between Thomas and Emma. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, and the buzz of conversation from the celebration seemed to fade into the background. Thomas took Emma's hand, leading her to a quiet corner of the garden where he'd planted a new bed of flowers, all varieties mentioned in her grandfather's book of pressed flowers. "I've been thinking about what Sophia said about forever gardens," he began, his voice soft but sure, "about how they need constant care and attention, but they give back so much more than we put into them." Emma's eyes widened as she recognized the flowers from her grandfather's book. "Thomas, when I came to this neighborhood, I was trying to escape a life that felt empty. I thought I was looking for simplicity, for authenticity. But what I really found was you." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small wooden box crafted from a piece of her grandfather's old store counter. Kneeling beside the flower bed, Thomas opened the box to reveal a ring. But it wasn't the flashy diamond one might expect from a wealthy CEO. Instead, it was a delicate band embedded with tiny seeds preserved in clear resin, surrounded by a spiral of small emeralds. "These are seeds from our first garden together," he explained, "because I want to spend the rest of my life growing with you, Emma, building something real and lasting, just like your grandfather did with this store, just like you've done with the library, just like we've done with this community." Emma's eyes filled with tears as she recognized the thoughtfulness behind the design. "Seeds and books," she whispered. "Our whole story in one ring." "Emma Martinez," Thomas continued, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Will you plant a forever garden with me? Will you marry me?" Before Emma could respond, a small gasp came from nearby. They turned to find Sophia watching with wide eyes, her hands clasped together in excitement. Behind her, Victoria, Richard, and Maria tried to look as if they hadn't been watching the whole scene unfold. Emma laughed through her tears, turning back to Thomas. "Yes," she said simply. Yes to forever gardens and community libraries, and growing together through whatever life plants in our path. As Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, cheers erupted from their not-so-subtle audience. Sophia ran forward to hug them both, followed by Victoria, who was actually crying, something she would later deny vehemently. "Well," Richard said, clearing his throat emotionally, "I suppose I'll be drafting a different kind of document now." Maria pulled him into a celebratory hug. "Oh, hush with the legal talk. This is about love and growth and forever gardens." As the news spread through the celebration, community members gathered to congratulate them. Children asked if they could help plant flowers for the wedding, and parents offered to contribute family recipes for the reception. In the midst of the joyful chaos, Thomas and Emma stood together by their flower bed, their fingers intertwined. The ring caught the late afternoon light, the seeds and emeralds sparkling with promise. "You know," Emma said softly, "when Sophia first asked about forever gardens, I thought she was just being a romantic child, but she understood something important, that the best things in life need room to grow, time to develop, and people who believe in their potential." Thomas squeezed her hand gently, just like a certain CEO who needed to become a farmer to find his way home. Above them, the spring sky stretched endlessly blue, full of possibility. Around them, their community celebrated not just their engagement, but the growth of something larger than themselves, a place where authentic connections flourished and forever gardens took root in the most unexpected places. News of Thomas and Emma's engagement spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, transforming the library opening celebration into an impromptu engagement party. The community's response was overwhelming. Everyone wanted to contribute to their upcoming wedding in some way. Maria immediately began planning a menu featuring produce from the community gardens. "A wedding feast should tell a story," she insisted, her eyes twinkling. "And your story began in these gardens." The children, led by an enthusiastic Sophia, formed what they called the Wedding Garden Committee, determined to grow all the flowers for the celebration themselves. They commandeered a special section of the community garden, carefully plotting out where each variety would be planted. "We need to calculate the growing times perfectly," Sophia explained seriously, consulting a notebook filled with her careful drawings. "Everything has to bloom exactly right for the wedding day." Emma found Thomas one morning, crouching beside Sophia and her friends as they debated the merits of different flower combinations. He was taking their suggestions with complete seriousness, helping them research optimal growing conditions for each variety they considered. "You're going to make a wonderful father," Emma said softly, watching him explain to a young boy why certain flowers needed more sunlight than others. Thomas looked up, his eyes meeting hers with such love that Emma's heart skipped a beat. Before he could respond, Victoria appeared with a stack of wedding magazines and a determined expression. "Now, I know you both want something simple and meaningful," she began, settling onto a garden bench. "But there are still decisions to be made. Have you thought about where you want to hold the ceremony?" Emma and Thomas exchanged glances. They hadn't discussed specific plans yet, but as they looked around at the flourishing community gardens, the answer seemed obvious. "Right here," they said simultaneously. Victoria raised an eyebrow. "In the garden? But what about—" "Mom," Emma interrupted gently, "this is where our story really began, where we built something true together. Where better to start our next chapter?" To their surprise, Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "Your father would have loved this," she said, reaching for Emma's hand. "He always said the best celebrations are the ones that grow naturally from love." Richard, who had been helping with legal paperwork nearby, joined their conversation. "You know, we could set up the ceremony between the garden boxes. The library could be open for the reception, a perfect blend of both your passions." The idea caught fire immediately. Soon the entire community was involved in the planning. Local artists offered to create decorations using recycled materials from the hardware store renovation. The children's reading group began preparing garden-themed poems to recite at the ceremony. One evening, as Thomas and Emma walked home from a planning session, they found Sophia sitting on their garden bench, looking troubled. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Emma asked, settling beside her. "I've been thinking," Sophia said seriously. After you get married, will you move away to a big mansion? Will you forget about us and the library and the gardens?" Thomas knelt in front of her. "Sophia, do you remember what you taught me about forever gardens?" She nodded solemnly. "Well, this community, the library, the gardens, all of you, this is our forever garden. Emma and I aren't going anywhere. We're just adding another chapter to our story." Sophia's face brightened. "Like in the books, when the story gets better because the characters grow together." "Exactly like that," Emma agreed, squeezing Thomas's hand. Later that night, as they sat in their garden under the stars, Thomas turned to Emma with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Sophia's question made me think, what do you want to do about living arrangements after the wedding?" Emma looked around at the garden they'd built together, the neighborhood they'd helped transform. "I love this place," she said simply. "The house, the garden, the whole community, it feels like home." "Even though it's not a mansion," Thomas teased gently. "Especially because it's not a mansion," Emma replied. "It's real. It's us." The next day brought more wedding preparations. The Children's Garden Committee presented their final flower-growing schedule, complete with hand-drawn illustrations and carefully calculated bloom times. Victoria had softened her stance on having a proper wedding, instead throwing herself into helping coordinate the community's various contributions. Even Richard had found his niche, working with local officials to ensure all permits were in place for their garden wedding. He'd also begun spending more time in the neighborhood, his corporate lawyer persona gradually giving way to something more authentic. As spring progressed, the wedding garden flourished under the careful attention of Sophia and her young team. Each new bloom was celebrated, each growing success shared with contagious enthusiasm. The entire community had become invested in creating not just a wedding, but a celebration of growth, transformation, and the power of authentic connection. Thomas and Emma found themselves at the center of this whirlwind of preparation and anticipation, yet somehow feeling more grounded than ever. Their evenings were spent in their garden, planning their future while watching their wedding flowers grow under the care of their young gardeners. "You know," Emma said one evening, watching Sophia and her friends water their carefully tended plants, "when I started the library, I thought I was just creating a place for books, but we've built something so much more, a place where stories come to life, where communities grow, where love takes root in the most unexpected ways." Thomas pulled her close, both of them bathed in the golden light of sunset. Around them their garden flourished, a living testament to the power of authentic love and patient growth. As the wedding day approached, the community gardens transformed into a magical space. The children's carefully planned flowers were beginning to bloom right on schedule, creating a tapestry of colors that seemed to tell Thomas and Emma's story in living art. Sophia had taken her role as head of the garden committee very seriously, creating detailed charts tracking each plant's progress. Every morning before school, she would check on their wedding flowers, making careful notes in her gardening journal. One morning, she made an exciting discovery. "Miss Emma! Mr. Tom!" she called out, running toward them as they arrived at the library. "The first roses are blooming. They're perfect." Indeed, the special variety of roses they'd chosen, a soft peach color that matched the sunset on the evening Thomas proposed, had produced its first perfect bloom. Sophia had tears in her eyes as she showed them. "See, I told you we could do it. Now your wedding will have the most beautiful flowers ever." Victoria, who had been watching from the library steps, joined them to admire the rose. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when I first pictured Emma's wedding, I imagined something very different, something more impressive," Thomas suggested gently. "More conventional," Victoria corrected. "But this..." She gestured at the flourishing garden, the excited children, the sense of community purpose. "This is better than anything I could have planned." Inside the library, preparations were equally heartwarming. The children's reading group had been practicing their garden poems, while local artists worked on transforming the space with natural materials and recycled hardware store items. Richard had surprised everyone by revealing a hidden talent for woodworking. He'd been spending his weekends crafting a special archway for the ceremony, incorporating elements from the old hardware store and designs inspired by favorite books from the library. "My grandfather taught me," he explained somewhat sheepishly, as he worked. "Said every lawyer should know how to build something real with their hands." The wedding plans themselves remained beautifully simple. They would be married in the heart of the community gardens, surrounded by flowers grown with love by their young gardeners. The reception would flow between the garden and the library, bringing together the two spaces that had shaped their love story. Maria and the other market vendors had planned a feast that celebrated both local produce and family traditions. "Food tells a story," she repeated often, teaching local children traditional recipes that would be part of the celebration. One afternoon, as Thomas helped Sophia and her friends with their wedding garden, a sleek car pulled up to the curb. A well-dressed woman emerged, Clara Watson, the reporter who had interviewed Thomas months ago. "Mr. Preston," she called out, approaching the garden. "I hope you don't mind the interruption. I've been following your story, and I'd like to do a feature on your wedding. The CEO who found love and purpose in a community garden. It's quite compelling." Before Thomas could respond, Sophia stepped forward protectively. "It's not about him being a CEO," she stated firmly. "It's about love and growing things and building forever gardens. That's the real story." Clara looked surprised, then thoughtful. She knelt down to Sophia's level. "Would you tell me about these forever gardens and about growing flowers for the wedding?" What followed was an impromptu interview with Sophia and her young gardening team, their enthusiasm and wisdom capturing the true heart of the story. Clara's notepad filled with quotes about love, growth, and the magic of helping things bloom. Emma found them later, the reporter now sitting cross-legged in the garden while children showed her their carefully tended plants. Thomas stood back, watching with a smile as Sophia explained the significance of each flower they'd chosen. "Not quite the story she expected," Emma observed, slipping her hand into his. "No," Thomas agreed. "But maybe it's the story people need to hear, about finding authenticity, about building something real, about how love grows best when it's rooted in truth." That evening, as the sun set over their flourishing garden, the community gathered for a wedding planning meeting that felt more like a family dinner. Victoria and Maria debated flower arrangements, while Richard showed off his progress on the arch. Sophia and her friends presented their latest garden updates with professional pride. Emma leaned against Thomas, watching their community, their family, come together. "You know what I love most about all this?" she asked softly. "What's that?" "Everyone's contributing in their own way, adding their own special touch to our story. It's not about impressing anyone or meeting expectations, it's just real." Thomas kissed her temple gently. "Like a garden," he murmured, each plant adding its own beauty to create something greater than the sum of its parts. Around them, their wedding garden bloomed under the careful tending of many loving hands, a living symbol of how the best things in life grow from authentic connections and patient care. The day before the wedding brought a flurry of activity to the neighborhood. The community gardens had never looked more beautiful, with every flower seemingly determined to bloom at exactly the right moment. Sophia and her young gardening team had achieved what professional florists might have deemed impossible, a perfectly timed display of natural beauty. "It's like the flowers know how special tomorrow is," Sophia declared, making her final rounds of inspection. She had taken to carrying a small notebook, meticulously checking off each detail from her carefully compiled list. The library had been transformed as well, with Richard's handcrafted arch standing proud in the garden's center. He had worked through the night to add final touches, delicate carvings of books and flowers intertwined along the wooden beams. "It's my way of showing how your two worlds came together," he explained, running his hand along the smooth wood. "Books and gardens, knowledge and growth." Victoria had surprised everyone by suggesting they incorporate elements from the old hardware store into the decoration. Display cases that had once held nuts and bolts now showcased carefully preserved flowers from the children's garden, each labeled with handwritten quotes about love and growth. "Your grandfather would have loved this," she told Emma, arranging old store ledgers that would serve as guest books. "He always said the best buildings are the ones that hold stories, not just things." Maria and her team had taken over the community center's kitchen, preparing traditional dishes that represented the neighborhood's diverse heritage. The air was filled with delicious aromas, as families contributed their own special recipes to the celebration. "Food is memory," Maria explained, teaching young helpers how to fold delicate pastries. "Tomorrow, we're not just feeding people, we're sharing our stories, our traditions, our love." As evening approached, the community gathered for a special dinner. Not a formal rehearsal, but a casual celebration of the journey that had brought them all together. Tables were set up throughout the garden, weaving between the flower beds. That would form the backdrop for tomorrow's ceremony. Thomas found himself seated between Sophia and Richard, an arrangement that seemed to perfectly symbolize his journey from corporate CEO to community member. Sophia was excitedly sharing her plans for future garden projects, while Richard discussed ideas for expanding their legal aid program. "You know," Richard said quietly, while Sophia was distracted by dessert, "I owe you an apology. When I first discovered your real identity, I thought exposing you would prove I was protecting the community. Instead, you showed me what really matters in building a meaningful life." Across the garden, Emma was deep in conversation with her mother and Maria, their heads close together as they finalized some detail or another. The setting sun caught her engagement ring, making the preserved seeds sparkle alongside the emeralds. Victoria stood, tapping her glass for attention. "Tomorrow we'll celebrate the official union of two people who have already shown us what true partnership looks like. But tonight, I want to thank them for something else. For helping all of us grow in unexpected ways." She paused, looking around at the gathered community. "When Emma first told me she was giving up a traditional teaching career to start a small library, I thought she was making a mistake. When she fell in love with a farmer, well, we all know how I reacted to that." Warm laughter rippled through the crowd. But Thomas, even when he wasn't being completely truthful about his identity, showed us something important: that real value isn't in what we own or what titles we hold, but in how we contribute to our community, how we help others grow. Sophia stood up importantly. "And how we build forever gardens." More laughter, but also nods of agreement. The child's simple phrase had become something of a community motto, representing their shared commitment to building lasting connections. As the evening wound down, Thomas and Emma took a quiet walk through their wedding garden. The flowers seemed to glow in the twilight, their colors softened, but their beauty unchanged. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Emma asked, squeezing his hand. "Only about one thing," Thomas replied. "What's that?" "That I won't be able to find words big enough to express how much I love you, how grateful I am that you saw past my deception to who I really am, who I could become with you." Emma stopped walking, turning to face him. "You don't need big words. You've shown it every day, in every seed planted, every child taught, every moment of genuine connection you've built here." Their moment was interrupted by Sophia calling out, "Miss Emma, you have to go home now. It's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding." They turned to find their young gardener standing firmly, hands on hips, clearly prepared to enforce traditional wedding superstitions. "She's right," Victoria agreed, appearing to collect her daughter. "Besides, we have some final preparations to make." As they prepared to part ways until the ceremony, Thomas looked around at their transformed garden, at the library that had become a center of community life, at the faces of people who had become family. "Tomorrow," he whispered to Emma before letting her go. "Tomorrow," she agreed, her eyes shining with joy and promise. Sophia tugged at Thomas's sleeve. "Don't worry, Mr. Tom. I'll make sure all the flowers are perfect for when you marry Miss Emma. It's going to be the most beautiful forever garden ever." Looking at the love and care that surrounded them, Thomas knew she was right, though perhaps not in the way she meant. The most beautiful garden wasn't the flowers that would decorate their wedding, but the community that had grown around them, nurtured by trust, authenticity, and the courage to believe in second chances. The morning of the wedding dawned with perfect clarity, as if nature itself had decided to celebrate with them. Sophia arrived at the gardens before sunrise, determined to check every flower one last time. She found Thomas already there, quietly, watering the plants in the soft morning light. "Mr. Tom," she exclaimed, "you're not supposed to be here. The wedding's not until afternoon." Thomas smiled at her concern. Just making sure our forever garden is ready for its big moment. Want to help me check everything one last time? Together they made their rounds of the garden, Sophia clutching her ever-present notebook. The flowers seemed to have saved their best performance for this special day. Every bloom was perfect, every color exactly as they had planned. "It's like magic," Sophia whispered, touching a perfect rose petal gently. "Like all the flowers, knew this was your special day." Meanwhile, at Victoria's house, Emma was surrounded by a flurry of preparation. Her wedding dress was simple but beautiful, made more special by the delicate embroidery Maria and other community women had added. Tiny flowers and books creating a pattern that told their story in stitches. "Something borrowed," Victoria said softly, presenting Emma with her grandmother's pearl necklace. "She wore it at her wedding and I wore it at mine." Emma touched the pearls gently, thinking of the generations of strong women in her family. "Mom, I need to tell you something." Victoria paused in her preparations, giving her daughter her full attention. "Thank you," Emma said simply, "for understanding, for seeing beyond what you initially wanted for me to what I actually needed, for accepting Thomas and helping build this community with us." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, my darling girl, you taught me that the best dreams aren't always the ones we plan. They're the ones that grow naturally from love and truth." At the garden, guests began arriving early, eager to help with final preparations. Richard was making minute adjustments to his arch, while Maria directed the setup of the celebration feast. The children's reading group practiced their garden poems one last time, their young voices carrying messages of growth and love. Thomas had gone home to prepare, but not before Sophia made him promise not to peek at the garden again until the ceremony. "It has to be a surprise," she insisted. "Like in the stories, when everything is revealed at the perfect moment." As the morning progressed, the library and garden filled with the warmth of community and anticipation. Local musicians set up in a corner of the garden, their soft melodies blending with the natural sounds of the space. The scent of flowers mixed with delicious aromas from Maria's feast, creating an atmosphere of sensory celebration. Clara Watson, the reporter, had returned as an invited guest rather than a journalist. She watched the preparations with genuine emotion, understanding now that the real story wasn't about a CEO finding redemption, but about a community growing stronger through authentic connections. Richard found himself sharing stories with other guests about the early days of skepticism and suspicion. "I thought I was protecting the community," he admitted. "Instead, they showed me what community really means." In her room, Emma stood before the mirror, her dress catching the late morning light. Victoria adjusted the pearl necklace while Maria fussed with the bouquet, a perfect combination of flowers from their wedding garden. "Miss Emma," Sophia's voice carried up from outside. "Everything's ready." "All the flowers are perfect, and Mr. Tom looks so nervous and happy, and everyone's here, and it's all so beautiful." Emma laughed, her joy bubbling over at the child's enthusiasm. This was exactly what she had wanted. Not a formal, impersonal ceremony, but a celebration of love that included their entire community. Victoria checked the time. "Almost there, sweetheart. Are you ready?" Emma looked out the window at the gathered community, at the garden they had all helped create, at the library that had become so much more than just a place for books. She thought of Thomas, who had come to her neighborhood seeking authenticity, and found love instead. "Yes," she said softly. "I've been ready since the moment I saw him planting his first garden." The morning sun climbed higher, casting dappled shadows through the leaves of the garden trees. In just a few hours, Thomas and Emma would stand beneath Richard's handcrafted arch, surrounded by Sophia's perfectly tended flowers and their beloved community, ready to begin their forever garden together. The afternoon sun painted the garden in golden light as guests took their places for the ceremony. Richard's handcrafted arch stood proudly at the center, its delicate carvings of books and flowers casting intricate shadows on the ground below. The garden paths had been transformed into natural aisles, with Sophia's perfectly timed flowers creating a living tapestry of color. Thomas stood beneath the arch, his nervous energy barely contained. He'd chosen to wear a simple but elegant suit, with a boutonniere made from flowers grown in their garden. Looking out at the gathered community, their community, he felt overwhelmed by the journey that had brought him here. Sophia appeared at his side, carrying her basket of flower petals. "Don't be nervous, Mr. Tom," she whispered. "Remember what you taught us about gardens. The best things grow from love and patience and truth." The soft music of local musicians filled the air, and a hush fell over the gathering as Emma appeared at the garden's entrance. Her dress caught the afternoon light, the embroidered flowers and books seeming to dance with her movement. Victoria walked beside her, pride and joy evident in every step. As Emma moved through the garden paths toward him, Thomas remembered their first meeting. Her arms full of books, her passion for helping others so evident, her authenticity drawing him in despite his deception. Now here she was, walking toward him with complete truth between them, ready to begin their forever garden together. The ceremony itself was beautifully simple. The children's reading group presented their garden poems, their young voices carrying messages of growth and renewal. Maria read a traditional blessing in Spanish, her words weaving together themes of love, community, and lasting growth. When it came time for their vows, Thomas took Emma's hands in his, aware of the calluses earned from genuine work in their garden. "Emma," he began, his voice steady despite his emotion, "I came to this neighborhood looking for authenticity, but what I found was so much more. You showed me that real value isn't in what we possess, but in what we cultivate, in our gardens, in our community, in our hearts." He paused, squeezing her hands gently. "I promise to grow with you, to nurture our love like we nurture our garden, to face each season together with honesty and trust. You've taught me that the best things in life, like the best gardens, need constant care, honest attention, and deep roots. I promise to be your partner in all seasons, to help our love flourish like the gardens we've grown together." Emma's eyes shone with tears as she began her own vows. "Thomas, when I first met you, I thought you were simply a farmer with a dream of growing things. Now I know you were actually growing into yourself, into the person you were meant to be. You've shown me that sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow from unexpected seeds." Her voice strengthened as she continued. "I promise to be your partner in all our growing seasons, to face challenges with the same patience we give our garden, to celebrate our successes with the same joy we feel when our first seeds sprout. You've helped me build something bigger than I ever imagined, and I promise to keep building, growing, and blooming with you." Sophia stepped forward importantly, presenting their rings on a small cushion she had decorated with pressed flowers from their garden. The rings were simple bands, but each had been engraved with tiny seeds and books, echoing Emma's engagement ring. As they exchanged rings, Victoria dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Maria beamed proudly. Richard, standing nearby, nodded in approval at the ceremony he had helped make possible. The official pronouncement of their marriage was met with a joyous cheer from the community. Sophia and her young gardening team tossed flower petals, all grown in their garden, as Thomas and Emma shared their first kiss as husband and wife beneath the arch that told their story in carved wood and growing things. As they turned to face their gathered community, Emma squeezed Thomas's hand. "Look at what we've grown together," she whispered. Indeed, looking out at their celebration, they saw not just a wedding gathering, but a thriving ecosystem of love and support. Children danced among the garden boxes they had helped tend, elderly neighbors shed happy tears, and even Richard looked genuinely moved by the authentic joy of the moment. The afternoon light continued to paint everything in golden hues as the ceremony transitioned into celebration. Maria's feast was unveiled, a beautiful combination of traditional recipes and fresh produce from their community gardens. The library's doors stood open, welcoming guests to move between the indoor and outdoor spaces that had become the heart of their community. Sophia grabbed the microphone from the musicians during a break, making an important announcement. "Mr. Tom and Miss Emma's forever garden is officially growing now, and we all get to help it grow bigger and stronger every day." Her simple declaration captured the essence of what they had created, not just a marriage, but a living, growing commitment to nurturing love, community, and authentic connection. The celebration continued into the evening, with lights strung, Through the garden, casting a magical glow over the festivities, the library and garden had become one seamless space, just as the various parts of Thomas and Emma's lives had merged into something beautiful and authentic. Victoria found them sharing a quiet moment near the original garden box where their story had begun. "I have something for you," she said, presenting them with the old book of pressed flowers from the hardware store. "Your grandfather started this tradition of preserving beautiful moments," she told Emma. "I think you two should continue it." Emma opened the book carefully, finding a new page had been added. Sophia and her young gardeners had pressed flowers from their wedding garden, carefully labeling each one with the date and a small note about its significance. "We've been keeping it a secret," Sophia explained, appearing as if by magic. "Every flower tells part of your story." As the evening progressed, their celebration became a beautiful blend of endings and beginnings. Richard announced that he was opening a small legal clinic in the neighborhood, dedicated to helping community members navigate challenges while teaching them about their rights. "You're not the only one who found a new purpose here," he told Thomas with a warm handshake. Maria presented them with a special recipe book, compiled from all the community members who had contributed to their wedding feast. "For your own family. Traditions," she said with a knowing smile, "to grow along with your garden." As the night drew to a close, Thomas and Emma found themselves once again in their garden, now transformed by the wedding celebration, but still essentially the same space where they had first begun to grow together. "Do you remember," Emma asked softly, "when you first started pretending to be a humble farmer?" Thomas laughed quietly. "I thought I was looking for simplicity, for something real. I never expected to find everything I never knew I needed." Their moment was interrupted by Sophia, who had one last important announcement to make. Standing on a chair, she addressed the remaining guests with all the solemnity a child could muster. "Attention, everyone. This is a very important day for our forever garden. But you know what Miss Emma taught us about gardens? They need everyone's help to grow. So we all have to promise to keep helping Mr. Tom and Miss Emma's love garden grow forever and ever." The community responded with enthusiastic agreement, and Sophia beamed with satisfaction. Her simple declaration had captured the essence of what Thomas and Emma had built, not just a relationship between two people, but a thriving ecosystem of community, purpose, and authentic connection. As the last guests departed, Thomas and Emma stood in their garden, surrounded by the flowers their community had helped grow. The library lights still glowed warmly through the windows, and the evening stars twinkled above like nature's own celebration lights. "So," Thomas said, pulling Emma close, "what do you think about our forever garden?" "I think," Emma replied, her eyes shining with joy and promise, "that this is just the beginning. The best gardens grow and change with every season, just like the best love stories. And we'll have plenty of help tending it," Thomas added, thinking of their dedicated young gardeners and supportive community. "Speaking of which," Emma said, with a mysterious smile, "I think our garden might need to grow in new ways soon." She took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "We might need to add a nursery section in about 8 months. Thomas's eyes widened with joy as he understood her meaning. Their forever garden was already growing in ways they hadn't imagined, promising new chapters in their story of love, growth, and authentic connection. In the years that followed, their garden continued to flourish and expand. The library became a model for community development, inspiring similar programs in neighborhoods across the city. Sophia grew into a dedicated young botanist, teaching new generations of children about the magic of helping things grow. But more importantly, Thomas and Emma's love story became a kind of modern folklore in their community, not because of its grand gestures or dramatic moments, but because it reminded everyone that the most beautiful things in life grow from authentic seeds, tended with patient love, and cultivated in the rich soil of truth and community. Their forever garden had indeed become exactly what Sophia had predicted, not just a physical space of flowers and books, but a living testament to the power of authentic love and the beauty of growing something real together.